Good evening and welcome to Novara Live. My name's Stephen Methan and I'm joined tonight by Helena, aka No Justice MTG. Helena, how's it going?
Doing pretty well. Good to be down at Novara Towers to co-host this evening. On my way to go lose at children's card games in Europe tomorrow.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. Now, we're going to get into it in a minute, but I was just thinking in 10 words, maybe give me your 10 words or less, give me your take on the outcome of this election.
Should have been obvious. Still
Should
shit.
So succinct, so perfect. Later on in the show, we'll be talking about an Israeli general who's declared the evacuation of northern Gaza almost complete. We'll be talking to a Palestinian academic who has won a legal battle with her university. And we'll look at how British liberals are taking Trump's election. Following Donald Trump's overwhelming victory in the US presidential election, Democratic candidate Kamala Harris has conceded.
Earlier today, I spoke with President-elect Trump and congratulated him on his victory. I also told him that we will help him and his team with their transition, and that we will engage in a peaceful transfer of power. A fundamental principle of American democracy is that when we lose an election, we accept the results. That principle, as much as any other, distinguishes democracy from monarchy or tyranny. And anyone who seeks the public trust must honor it. At the same time, in our nation, we owe loyalty not to a president or a party, but to the Constitution of the United States. And loyalty to our conscience and to our God. My allegiance to all three is why I am here to say, while I concede this election, I do not concede the fight that fueled this campaign.
So there were some obvious references there to Trump's refusal to concede in 2020 and his subsequent bid to overturn the election result that year. And Trump still hasn't admitted publicly that he lost that election. But there were also some nods to some of Harris's own campaign lines, which warned of impending tyranny should Trump win this time around. Now, Harris took her time about conceding, giving her speech at alma mater Howard late on Wednesday afternoon. That led to this headline in the Daily Mail. Sore loser, Kamala still hasn't admitted she lost as world waits for concession speech and Biden stays silent. That's pretty rich, given who just won the election. Harris's speech wasn't just a concession, it also involved some words of consolation for her supporters.
On the campaign, I would often say, when we fight, we win. But here's the thing. Sometimes the fight takes a while. That doesn't mean we won't win. The important thing is don't ever give up. Don't ever stop trying to make the world a better place. You have power. And don't you ever listen when anyone tells you something is impossible because it has never been done before. You have the capacity to do extraordinary good in the world. And so to everyone who is watching, do not despair. This is not a time to throw up our hands. This is a time to roll up our sleeves. This is a time to organize, to mobilize, and to stay engaged for the sake of freedom and justice and the future that we all know we can build together.
Don't ever stop trying to make the world a better place by, supporting a genocide in Gaza. Harris ended her speech by going pretty full California.
And I'll close with this. There's an adage an historian once called a law of history, true of every society across the ages. The adage is, only when it is dark enough can you see the stars. I know many people feel like we are entering a dark time, but for the benefit of us all, I hope that is not the case. But here's the thing, America, if it is, let us fill the sky with the light of a brilliant, brilliant billion of stars. The light of optimism, of faith, of truth, and service.
What does it even mean? Helena, before we get into it, any thoughts on Harris's speech?
I think what it does say to me is I don't think she's a bad speaker. Certainly she's not Obama, but she's clearly leagues ahead of plenty of other candidates who could theoretically have been in this position once Biden stepped down. The frustration, of course, is in the messaging. It's in the rhetoric. It's in the kind of meaningless pablum that's come to be a major part of Harris's speeches and part of her rhetoric throughout this campaign, ever since she dropped a bunch of the messages that really kind of characterized the Democratic surge in confidence as soon as she replaced Biden at the top of the ticket. All that rhetoric is gone. The calling Republicans weird is gone. It's all been essentially just business as usual. Let's keep things safe. Let's allude to things that are very, very safe for people who are already entrenched within the party, like, allusions to being the first woman president again, which of course didn't really come up in any amount of voters' reasons for getting out to the polls in the first place, because of course it didn't actually gel with the public consciousness at all. And if she'd had better messaging, if she'd had better speech writers, if she had something more sustainable and kind of concrete to offer people, maybe if she wasn't running off the back of a very kind of hated incumbent, maybe she would have had something a little bit more substantial to be able to mount in a presidential campaign. But unfortunately, she was thrust into the worst position, and all she has left is pablum.
Yeah, it's almost like as a kind of political character, she sort of developed over the course of the campaign, which is sort of too late to be developing as a political figure. Once you enter that stage, you've got to be pretty fully formed, especially to take on someone like Donald Trump, right?
Exactly. And what do we see? Just the same kind of things you heard in her regular stump speech across the campaign trail. Like, this is somebody who's had to not only find their own identity, but has had to have their identity as a politician thrust upon them in the wake of not having any individual identity as a political candidate, and therefore she has nowhere to go to show authenticity. Despite, as I said, I think that she's a reasonable speaker and rhetorician, that didn't actually pull through in terms of engaging voters in wanting to, Pokemon go to the polls, quote unquote.
Yeah, I guess having that sort of less developed stage character is a kind of double-edged sword because, of course, at the beginning it allows everyone to project onto you whatever they want, whatever they hope for. But by the end, when that's not delivering, it starts to fade away. Perhaps that's part of what happened here. Anyway, US President Joe Biden gave his own speech today, speaking from the White House Rose Garden. He reflected on his legacy and on the future.
I know people are still hurting, but things are changing rapidly. Together, we've changed America for the better. Now we have 74 days to finish the term, our term. Let's make every day count. That's the responsibility we have to the American people. Look, folks, you all know it in your lives. Setbacks are unavoidable, but giving up is unforgivable. Setbacks are unavoidable, but giving up is unforgivable. We all get knocked down, but the measure of our character, as my dad would say, is how quickly we get back up. Remember, a defeat does not mean we are defeated. We lost this battle. The America of your dreams is calling for you to get back up.
Now, while Biden was quite rightly, given he's the president, quiet over polling day, he posted this after Harris's speech. What America saw today was the Kamala Harris I know and deeply admire. She's been a tremendous partner and public servant, full of integrity, courage, and character. Under extraordinary circumstances, she stepped up and led a historic campaign that embodied what's possible when guided by a strong moral compass and a clear vision for a nation that is more free, more just, and full of more opportunities for all Americans. As I've said before, selecting Kamala was the very first decision I made when I became the nominee for president in 2020. It was the best decision I made. Her story represents the best of America's story. And as she made clear today, I have no doubt that she'll continue writing that story. She will continue the fight with purpose, determination, and joy. She will continue to be a champion for all Americans. Above all, she'll continue to be a leader our children will look up to for generations to come as she puts her stamp on America's future. Now, it's interesting that Biden called Harris's campaign historic. In some ways, it obviously could have been, with Harris a contender to be both the first woman and the first black woman president of the country. But in other ways, the only thing that was really historic about the Harris campaign was how shockingly bad the result was. In 2016, even though Hillary Clinton lost the election in the Electoral College, she won the popular vote, taking just over 40%. Trump, meanwhile, got just over 46%. Sorry, that should have said just over 48%. Trump, meanwhile, got just over 46%. In 2020, Biden won just over 51% of the popular vote amidst a huge turnout, with Trump taking just under 47%. So not that far off his share in 2016. Now, votes are still being counted in a few states, so these results aren't final, but at the moment it looks like the 2020 figures have more or less flipped. Harris is at around 48% of the vote, a little better than Trump in 2020, while Trump this cycle is at 51%. To put things in raw numbers, Harris appears to have lost around 10 million voters compared to 2020. And while turnout in this election was lower than 2020, it isn't set to be much lower. According to the Washington Post, turnout is set to be just 1% lower than the historic high of 2020. As Michael pointed out on the show yesterday, incumbents around the world have been losing power in the wake of COVID and the inflation crisis. This graph from the FT's John Byrne Murdoch shows that every incumbent in an election in 2024 lost significant vote share, and it's the first time that's happened since World War II. In fact, with just a 3% loss in her share, Harris seems to have fared better than most incumbents facing their electorate this year, though still pretty badly, of course. That points to a global phenomenon. People hate inflation and they blame those in charge when it happens. But does that mean the failure of the Harris campaign doesn't hold lessons for centrists who bank on business as usual as a way to win? Of course not. Democratic Senator Bernie Sanders, who loyally stumped for Harris throughout her campaign, had a few ideas about how the Democrats could have done better. So he said, "It should come as no great surprise that a Democratic Party which has abandoned working class people would find that the working class has abandoned them. First, it was the white working class, and now it is Latino and black workers as well. While the Democratic leadership defends the status quo, the American people are angry and want change. And they're right. Today, while the very rich are doing phenomenally well, 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, and we have more income and wealth inequality than ever before. Unbelievably, real inflation accounted for weekly wages for the average American worker are actually lower now than they were 50 years ago. Today, despite an explosion in technology and worker productivity, many young people will have a worse standard of living than their parents, and many of them worry that artificial intelligence and robotics will make a bad situation even worse. Today, despite spending far more per capita than other countries, we remain the only wealthy nation not to guarantee healthcare to all as a human right, and we pay by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. We alone among major countries cannot even guarantee paid family and medical leave. Today, despite strong opposition from a majority of Americans, we continue to spend billions funding the extremist Netanyahu government's all-out war against the Palestinian people, which has led to the horrific humanitarian disaster of mass malnutrition and the starvation of thousands of children. Will the big money interests and well-paid consultants who control the Democratic Party learn any real lessons from this disastrous campaign? Will they understand the pain and political alienation that tens of millions of Americans are experiencing? Do they have any ideas as to how we can take on the increasingly powerful oligarchy, which has so much economic and political power? Probably not. In the coming weeks and months, those of us concerned about grassroots democracy and economic justice need to have some very serious political discussions. It is good to see Bernie take the gloves off, even if it is with the luxury of hindsight. Helena, we'll get into some other criticisms of the campaign in a moment, but what do you think of Bernie's assessment?
I mean, every single word is 100% correct. Every single word. It's interesting. We talk about working class people and Latino voters, especially, and men. Were all groups who absolutely supported Bernie Sanders during the primary campaigns, which the DNC screwed him over on. And these are the people who have now left the Democratic coalition in the wake of the recent election. So he's absolutely right to call this out specifically. There's a failure of messaging. There's a failure of campaign strategy. There's so many different things that have failed working class people and failed to try and get their votes back, having essentially lost them when the inflation crisis started. Now, of course, there is a heavy disadvantage to being an incumbent when global headwinds make inflation worse, especially considering that economically the Biden administration were doing good things by running deficits and full employment economics and making sure that bottom quartile wages were rising. But the electorate isn't looking at whether or not the wages are rising in terms of inflation. If the price goes up, that is something that they're going to feel in their pockets immediately. Maybe if the election was a year later, they would be able to see the extra money in their pocket go further. But this close out from when the inflation crisis really started, the Democrats needed to campaign very specifically and very vigorously against the main culprits of this inflation, which was, of course, price gouging companies. Greedflation as a concept was abandoned as a campaign strategy incredibly early on because the Democratic Party is entirely beholden to its corporate donors and the corporate class that funds it, and they didn't want to piss them off. They didn't want to do it. They was a story that's been talked about today, how somebody who was high up at Uber was somebody related to Kamala Harris and told her to stop with the anti-corporate messaging. How are you supposed to defend your record that people are railing against without finding some kind of villain to be able to blame for the problems, especially when that villain is real and exists and is to blame, which is the corporations that price gouged. Isabella Weber made it very, very clear that greedflation was to blame. The economist Isabella Weber, who you should all go follow, which I highly recommend her content and her takes. And she was really pointing out how if they'd have properly intervened to stop price gouging when price gouging was a thing, rather than 2 years later coming back around and saying, oh, we'll do a price gouging ban. I'm sorry, it's far too late. It's far too late once people have already reacted to those problems that the inflation crisis has caused, and you have not served up any solution. You've not served up anybody to blame other than yourselves and your governance. This was always going to cost them huge numbers of votes at the elections, and we all saw most voters' biggest concern. Their biggest concern was on the economy. And what did the Harris campaign do? Well, they immediately moved away from it. There was. So Ash Sarkar tweeted out something today, which I think is very prescient, Novara's own Ash Sarkar, which was that she was approached by somebody at the tube station talking about the election, saying that the problem was there was too many celebrities. And this actually, I think, 100% true. Nothing is more out of touch. Nothing is more horrendously out of touch at a time when there is a real anti-elitist sentiment, a real populist sentiment across the Western world, but definitely within America. That's what Trump represents, the right populist argument. And there was no left populist foil to that. And what they were doing was trying to win an election, not by addressing the concerns of voters directly, not trying to do that at all, but spending their time courting the endorsements of celebrities. The wealthy elites are not affected by the inflation crisis, not affected by that. The one thing that every single poll threw up as well was the campaigning on Trump bad, Orange Man bad, he's a threat to democracy, he's a fascist, he said that he admired Hitler, which are all true things and all things that are bad about him. None of these things were resonating with voters. None of them were at all. Yet when individual polling was done, talking about the billionaire class, talking about corporate oligopoly, these were all things that absolutely resonated with voters, and it all were abandoned. There was a really good article shared by Crystal Ball today talking about how if Bernie Sanders was the candidate in either of the elections that the Democrats have recently lost, they would have been able to win explicitly on this message, either outside of the financial crisis in 2008 and the harm that caused and the failure of Obama to really take them to task, and what happened during the pandemic. If Bernie Sanders had been the person who was directing where the campaign would go or was at the head of the campaign, they would have done far better. And I think he was the candidate he absolutely would have won. And he clearly knows where the American electorate is at in terms of their concerns. And the Harris campaign just didn't. They just didn't do it. And there's one thing I want to take this conversation back to, which is the attitudes that we are seeing in the result of the loss, is trying to blame the people who voted Trump as being unconcerned with other people, or who were people who had just hated Kamala Harris because he's, like I said, a misogynist. And whilst there was definitely some misogyny at play here, I'm not saying that there wasn't. This desire for the Democratic base to reject the concerns of anyone that falls outside their group and saying, well, you can't have done about the economy. You prioritizing the economy over the things that we care about, that you must therefore be a misogynist, right? And it brings me back to this Eddie Dempsey statement that he made during the Brexit campaign, when he was talking about how even people who do have racist sentiment, they turn out because they are united by their hatred of the liberal left, because they've taken over the institutions that should fight for working class people in this country. The Labour Party under Blair and the Democratic Party for time immemorial have believed that they can win elections off of trying to court the votes of lower middle class to wealthy middle class people who are socially conscious, alongside a coalition of ethnic minorities who have basically no base in the Republican Party because of their historic racism. And they think that they can not actually address the needs of working class people because that voting coalition is enough to get them over the line. And I'm sorry, it just isn't. This election proves that it's not. This election absolutely proves that it isn't. And unless they turn towards a genuine populist message on economics for working class people, they will fail again. They will fail again. And this is the story for them to learn from this election.
Well, let's see if they learn it. I'd be surprised. Criticisms of the Harris campaign have come from all angles. One that seems pretty obvious is their desire to be seen as attractive to Republicans and the company Harris kept while doing it. Liz Cheney, a former Republican member of the House of Representatives and daughter of Iraq War architect and profiteer Dick Cheney, pretty much served as a Harris proxy for much of the campaign. And here she was with an important announcement for Harris back in September.
Dick Cheney, your father, a beloved figure among Democrats for many, many years. Do you, if you know who he will be supporting or who he'll be voting for, do you care to share with us who he might be voting for?
Dick Cheney will be voting for Kamala Harris.
Dick Cheney will be voting for Kamala Harris is not really a line progressives with any kind of memory expect to hear. Except Harris appeared thrilled.
Look, I just recently did an event with Liz Cheney, the former Congresswoman.
I know.
Her father, the former Vice President, Dick Cheney, has supported me.
Unbelievable.
There are over 200 former members of both Bush presidencies, John McCain, Mitt Romney, who have endorsed me.
Right.
Leading thinkers in the national security space.
Leading thinkers in the national security space have endorsed me, so vote for me, working America. Now, this strategy of appealing to country over party and bipartisanship, courting hero voters who switch party by tacking to the center and using high-profile defectors as standard bearers, is the exact same strategy employed by the Labour Party in July's general election. One can only assume that this was also the advice given to the Democrats by famous winner Jonathan Ashworth and his friends when a delegation of Labour strategists flew out to the states to share campaign tips, much to the chagrin of the president-elect. There is, however, quite a difference between a milquetoast liberal like Anna Soubry and a neocon like Cheney, who is universally despised. It anyway didn't translate into success, as registered Republicans failed to move at all, even a whisker, from 2020 to 2024. And the states where they did manage to move the dial, such as Wyoming and Utah, are so deep red, they wouldn't stand a chance there, even in a blue wave year. Helena, the strategy was completely ineffective, but why did it prove to be quite so bad?
Well, there's two main reasons for this. So first of all, that kind of basics of the strategy. If you compare what Labour were doing with what the Democrats were doing by trying to court these people. And now, first of all, there is no swing voter in the way there is in the UK, with a very malleable electorate who are very happy to swing from party to party if they think that they've changed their allegiance based upon what the circumstances are at each election. Whereas the camps are more entrenched. In American politics, the people are far more loyal to their particular political stripes in a way that they really aren't in the UK. So the chance of courting a quote unquote hero voter is much lower. And second of all, because it's different between constituencies and states that you have to win as part of the swing electorate. It's a completely different demographic that you have to go after, right? Whereas obviously the Labour Party were chasing middle class homeowners because they're the part of the electorate that everybody has to pander to because they change their vote more likely than anybody else. In America, if you're going after Republican voters, even only a small amount of them, and you alienate your base elsewhere, whether it is a racial minority or whether it's poor people, the precariat, working class people, or young people, they are in every state. Every single state will have a collection of these people. And if you lose those people to pick up swing voters in states that you cannot win, that is the complete opposite strategy of the electoral efficiency that Morgan McSweeney piloted to such success at the Labour landslide this year, despite the fact that it didn't really increase their vote share very much at all by having the votes in the right areas. And this way, they actually reduce votes in the wrong areas and increase votes in the wrong areas as well. Now, the other half of this is the kind of people that we had endorsing. Of course, you mentioned, the difference between Cheney and Soubry as the different halves between the Conservative Party and the Republican Party. And the biggest factor here is that whilst conservatives do in this country, or like people who would usually vote conservative, still quite like the One Nation Tories that were kind of more likely to endorse Keir Starmer in the run-up to the election. In America, the kind of base the Republican Party now has, like the Make America Great Again crowd, they absolutely, they viscerally hate the neocons. They really hate them. The America First sector of the Republican Party, they are at an all-out internal factional war within their own party against the neocon establishment because they hate the wars. If there's one thing that you saw that Trump could campaign on was his quote unquote history of not starting any wars, which I think it's a bit murky, but you can at least see that he's trying to project this idea of being a dove rather than a hawk, even though I don't think that's necessarily true. And Dick Cheney is the king. He is the king of all of the hawks. He's the king of the neocons. And there was nobody in the Republican base you could win over by getting the Dick Cheney endorsement. But his popularity in the wake of the Iraq War it's rock bottom. It really, really is rock bottom. And so they not only alienated their own base by taking on somebody that Democrats absolutely hate for actually most of the same reasons that the MAGA crowd. It's just a catastrophically poor election decision that is symptomatic of a Democratic Party establishment that see themselves, quote unquote, as the sensible politicians bridging the gap via bipartisanship, wanting to be part of a political dynasty and a political class, rather than actually understanding what voters even care about, who they like, and who is even potential as a candidate to try and move people over from the other side. Just a real gigantic failure of political strategy from the Harris campaign.
While the world was in the thrall of the US elections, the Israeli military appeared to say the quiet bit out loud. Palestinians will not be allowed to return to their homes in northern Gaza. That's according to statements made in a briefing by Brigadier General Itzik Cohn, who added that aid would only be allowed to enter the south of the Gaza Strip and not the north. The ethnic cleansing of Gaza has long been a suspected aim of Israel's war on the territory, and Cohn added that the military were getting closer to the, quote, complete evacuation of the north of the Strip. Now, since those comments were made on Tuesday night, the Israeli military has claimed they were taken out of context. Apparently, they also didn't, quote, reflect the IDF's objectives and values. I feel like plenty of people would disagree with that. It's not known how many Palestinians remain in the north of the territory, but on Wednesday, scores of people carrying children and belongings were seen leaving the region, heading south from the northern town of Beit Lahir for safety. Many of them will have been repeatedly displaced over the last year, and one of them, Hudu Abu Laila, told the AP that many hadn't eaten in days. She also said, "We came barefoot, we have no sandals, no clothes, nothing, we have no money, there is no food or drink." Israel has also been conducting operations to clear the Jabalia refugee camp. Drone footage released by the Israeli military shows the extent of the destruction being wrought on the camp, and the military seems to have changed its line on why they're bombing. It's no longer about targeting resistance fighters, but rather about, quote, stopping Hamas fighters regrouping. Destroying civilian infrastructure just in case an enemy militia might use them is certainly a war crime. Some Palestinians fleeing Jabalia sought shelter in nearby al-Shati refugee camp. They were also bombed today, with at least 12 people reported killed in a school sheltering the displaced. One survivor told Reuters this: "Suddenly, we heard the sound of an explosion and we found people flying everywhere. People were dismembered here and there. People were burned. I don't know. They, Israel, say it is safe, but there is nowhere safe. Where is safe? All of them are civilians here. They all came from camps in Jabalia to here." And in signs that Israel's genocide on the Palestinians will extend even to the country's own citizens, the Knesset has now passed a new law. Israel will now be allowed to deport relatives of Palestinian resistance members to Gaza, including Israeli citizens. That, of course, means Palestinian Israeli citizens. The law allows family members of resistance members to be deported for expressing support or for failing to report them to the police. Helena, of course, Israeli Palestinians live under conditions of apartheid, just like Palestinians in the occupied territories do. But this is the first time, I think, that the Knesset is now turning the focus on the Palestinians who live amongst Israelis as Israelis. What do you make of it?
It's just the only democracy in the Middle East acting as it would do again. What a surprise. Is anybody surprised? I don't think we are. Like when we saw, for example, the footage that we see of people pouring out of the northern Gaza Strip as they have been essentially been ethnically cleansed. That's what that is when you expel the entire population of an area based upon an ethnicity that's just ethnic cleansing. That's what it is. We all know that North Gaza is the place that they do want to settle. It's where the beachfront property will get set up during the Trump campaign. I'm almost certain of it. And seeing the streams of these people pouring out of these areas, it's so Nakba adjacent. It's not even funny at this point. It doesn't feel real to see these scenes coming out of North Gaza. All the photos that I've seen of the marches out of Lida and Ramla just repeated in front of my eyes day after day after day as these people are displaced over and over and over again and killed on the way and when they get to their refugee camps that they have to shelter in anyway. And now the brutal authoritarianism of the Netanyahu regime turning the eye on its own citizens, as in citizens not who have anything actually to do with the various militant groups in Gaza and the West Bank. No, who are just related to them and essentially trying to blackmail them into giving away information to the Israeli state on the pain of getting deported to the place where they are also trying to ethnically cleanse people is barbarity of the highest order. That's the only way I can call it, right? This is not a democratic state in the way that people like to continue to say that it is. It's just not the case. It's not been a case for a very, very, very long time. And you almost think that it's kind of cope at this point that people continue repeating this line that we ally with them because they're supposed to be a democracy like ours. There are sorts of failures of British democracy. We don't do this, do we? We don't do this. And the fact that, again, we are still selling these people weapons and still giving them diplomatic support internationally, it beggars belief. But at the end of the day, nothing surprises me anymore.
But also, you have an open air prison, Gaza, you bomb it to pieces, you ethnically cleanse the people from the north, force the entire population into the south in an even smaller enclosure. There's very little humanitarian aid going in. The medical infrastructure has almost completely collapsed. And then you decide that's the place that you're going to deport people. I mean, that is a concentration camp, right? There's no other word for it, surely.
I mean, exactly. I mean, it sounds very much like that was what that would be to me. If you're using it as a place where you can essentially put political prisoners, like if you're deporting people, you're not even deporting to a different country, you're deporting them to a territory that you occupy, right? It's basically kind of been de facto annexed at this point. So you're just moving somebody, you're essentially imprisoning somebody for political reasons within your own borders at this point. Because that's where we are when you have a military occupation of this scale for this time period, and then using it to inflict horrible crimes on the people while they're in there. It sounds what that's like to me.
Shahad Abu Salama is a Palestinian academic who worked at Sheffield Hallam University. That was also where she studied for her PhD. But in January 2022, just 3 days into her employment, the university launched an investigation into comments Abu Salama made on social media. In those comments, she defended a first-year student who had made a poster using the phrase, "Stop the Palestinian Holocaust." Novara Media reports this. Abu Salama wrote that she wouldn't use such a politicized word herself, but that she could understand why the student would. Maybe she thought she'd garner European sympathy by evoking the Never Again slogan, Abu Salama wrote. Colleagues mounted a campaign in defense of Abu Salama, and the investigation was dropped shortly after it began. But far from that being the end of Abu Salama's ordeal, it was merely the beginning. The Novara media report goes on to say this. But in June 2022, a second complaint was made about comments made by Abu Salama that could have fallen within the controversial IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. An investigation was launched by human rights barrister Akua Reindorf, who cleared her of any wrongdoing. At that point, Abu Salama wanted out, and she entered into an ACAS conciliation process to agree the terms of her departure. Those terms included a mutual non-disparagement agreement with the university, so an element of confidentiality and a promise that neither party would criticize the other publicly. Now, throughout Abu Salama's ordeal, the Jewish Chronicle had taken an extremely active interest in her case, digging up decades-old tweets and painting her as a terrorist sympathizer. And less than a month after Abu Salama agreed the confidential terms of her departure, the Chronicle ran this story. Lecturer who praised terrorist as beautiful fighter, no longer employed by a university. In the article, the Chronicle revealed this. The disclosure made to this newspaper by a senior university official came on the eve of an announcement today that Sheffield Hallam is about to build a second southern branch at Brent Cross in the heart of North London's Jewish community. After the months of secrecy regarding Dr. Abu Salama's fate, it is notable that the university and the developers reached out to the JC, explicitly stating that they wished to address her case. So, according to the Jewish Chronicle, the university appeared to have deliberately breached its confidentiality agreement with Abu Salama, and perhaps even provided information to a newspaper that had been, in my opinion, harassing her. Sheffield Hallam University denies this, but the Jewish Chronicle also failed to mention that Abu Salama had been cleared of the anti-Semitism allegations by the university's own investigations. Of course, that the Chronicle peddles in the poorest and most partial standards of journalism is now established fact. In September this year, 4 columnists quit the newspaper amid questions over its secretive ownership, increasingly fanatical political directions, and very dodgy standards. And the newspaper went into free fall after it emerged that it had published apparently fabricated stories about Israel's war on Gaza. But that wasn't the end of Abu Salama's ordeal. Novara Media reports this. In fact, the university allegedly went even further, mounting a far-reaching briefing campaign between August and November 2022, sending information about the case to Keir Starmer, then leader of the opposition, other MPs, London Mayor Sadiq Khan, various media organizations, and Argent, the property developer building the campus. The university's legal team denied sending documents to Starmer or Khan and denied that its briefing contained any confidential information. Now, Abu Salama has claimed victory after a lengthy legal battle with Sheffield Hallam, one that saw her win an undisclosed sum from the institution. In a statement to Novara Media, the university said this. We can confirm that the university has reached a mutually agreed settlement with a former member of staff. Given the nature of the agreement, we now consider this matter closed and won't be providing any further comment. Earlier today, I was joined by Shahad Abu Salama, and I began by asking her how she felt about her victory in the case.
I feel absolutely relieved that the case is over. However, I shouldn't have gone through this. And the news come at the darkest times of our lives with no exaggeration. Unfortunately, I feel like I cannot rejoice over this achievement, which is very important, really important. However, in the middle of losing everything, of seeing everything familiar to you destroyed, and of understanding the link between the persistent and consistent demonization of the Palestinians for so long, which I manifest in my example, and where we are now, we are not naive to believe that genocide has started, in vacuum. It hasn't started in vacuum, and there has been processes, long-standing processes that even go back to before the foundation of the Israeli state, that have facilitated the erasure of Palestine and the oppression of the Palestinians, and predicated on the manipulation of our history and the demonization of our identity. And that is not acceptable. First and foremost, I was attacked for being Palestinian, and I came a long way from a refugee camp, from Jabalia refugee camp that has been turned into a slaughterhouse by Israel. And I earned a PhD from Sheffield Hallam, and was excited to join their staff and start teaching, until I became under attack by Zionist media, and particularly Jewish News and the Jewish Chronicle. And my university, where I studied and taught, was the one that unfortunately made me vulnerable to all this backlash.
Your suffering is very evident in your voice, and I really don't want to drag it out. But I do want to ask. You talk about these methods for delegitimizing Palestinian identity, Palestinian voices. One of the ways that appears to have been done in this case is the Jewish Chronicle publishing stories about you earlier on in the case, and then later. What was it like for you to see that attack happening on the pages of a British newspaper?
So I relocated from Gaza to the UK in 2014 to join a master's at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies. And since I stepped foot in this country, I became aware of how vile the Jewish Chronicle is. And it's a platform that shouldn't be taken seriously. It has no integrity. It has no ethics, and no moral compass. And all it does is whitewash Israeli crimes and glorify its image before Western audiences, and particularly before British audiences. So I wasn't surprised by the Jewish Chronicle tarnishing my reputation or misrepresenting me. This is an agent of the Israeli state, and as a Palestinian, I expected to be hated by agents of the Israeli state. But the hurtful thing is that the university has reached out without any prior consultation to the Jewish Chronicle and other hostile media, while knowing that I am a vulnerable member of their community. I was at the time a refugee in England, and like existing as a Palestinian is enough struggle, really, and to be hounded and attacked and chased and harassed for just existing, for just being, for just speaking about our experiences of growing under occupation, of surviving all these acts of mowing the lawn in Israeli parlors, and to see my university basically compromising my well-being and not honoring its own duties of care towards its student and staff member, and all that for what? Like, it was very shocking for me to be treated like that by my own university, despite knowing as well of all these Orientalist processes that have infiltrated most mainstream organizations in the UK. It was still hurtful for me to be in the face of such treatment, and it was unprecedented in my university that a member of staff is treated as such. I wasn't targeted because of who I am as a person. I was targeted because of who I stand for. I just wanted to bring out this absurdity of how my whole struggle started when I first declared that I am going to become an associate lecturer at the media department of Sheffield Hallam University, driving Zionists crazy and angry against me. And then the main statement that has brought me under attack was the fact that I defended a first-year undergraduate student at the University of Sheffield who wrote a banner in 2021 saying, "Stop the Palestinian Holocaust." And where do you begin to unpack the absurdity here, especially when I am right now standing in front of you and my home, my family home, has been destroyed on 3 stages during the Gaza genocide. Not to mention the dozens of people whom we've lost, including children that were barely, that have barely had a chance to live. My home, in every stage of destruction that was inflicted on Gaza, in every invasion that happened against Jabalia refugee camp in particular, has faced another phase of destruction. The first time they invaded Jabalia, they bombed it 3 times. The second time, they set it on fire. And the third time, which we learned of only last week, our home was razed to the ground, and it is as if it had never existed. It was a 6-floor building that hosted us and hosted my brother's family and hosted other families as well who are now destitute and have nowhere to return for. So we are watching Holocaust actually being inflicted on our people. And the Zionists are offended by how we describe our own experiences, but not by the crime. It is outrageous. It is just simply outrageous, and it shouldn't be acceptable, and it should make every person with any shred of humanity to wake up and speak up and realize that if this is allowed, if such travesties of injustice are allowed against the Palestinians, how can they guarantee that they will be safe from it?
That was Shahad Abu Salama, who spoke to me earlier today. And I'm sure that her pain, as well as her strength, came across to you just as clearly as it did to me during that interview. The single defining characteristic of the liberal is that they never learn. Whilst for those of us on the left, the reasons for Harris's defeat seem obvious, for the liberal commentariat, they seem unable to find a single criticism of the Kamala Harris campaign. Lewis Goodall is one of the rising stars of the liberal podcast industrial complex, and just like Rory Stewart, he seems to believe it's impossible that the Democrats fumbled the bag so badly. He tweeted this: "There was no strategic mistake for Harris here, a la 2016. Trump did better with everyone, everywhere. It's a red wave. That's just a natural phenomenon, like an earthquake." His inexplicable absolution of Harris didn't stop there, though. A gracious, decent concession speech from Harris. Harris afforded that legitimacy and graciousness to Trump in a way, of course, he never did to the Biden-Harris ticket in 2020. She certainly left herself open for another run. Certainly not impossible. Not impossible, but very unadvisable. So she lost both the Electoral College and the popular vote. She tied herself to a highly disliked incumbent, threw her own base under the bus, suffered the unique humiliation of being only the second Democrat in 35 years to lose the popular vote, and to someone with an even lower approval than her. And Lewis thinks, she should run again. These people really do live in a bubble, don't they? And speaking of bubbles, one was finally burst the other day as James O'Brien discovered the real concerns of American voters.
Let's start with Mateless, who did sterling work last night across all manner of platforms. But I don't know if you remember, was it a year ago? When Emily went to America to sort of test the waters, when everybody presumed that 2024 would be Biden versus Trump. Emily went to America and sought to establish, the lie of the land, electorally speaking. And I was taken aback, actually. I don't think I conveyed it on air. But I was really surprised by the first thing she said to me, which is that the main topic of conversation, or the thing that people seem to care most about, was the price of petrol, or gasoline, as they call it, at the pumps. Now, that was interesting for a number of reasons, but chiefly because for people like me, and possibly you, who presume that little things like trying to launch an insurrection against a democratically elected government, being found by a court essentially to be a rapist, or being a multiple felon. All of these things that I thought, and you possibly thought, or would have thought, would overshadow everything else. I'm fond of the phrase, as you know, personal depravity. The idea that Donald Trump's personal depravity would push all other concerns out of the electoral space, out of the political space. I don't care what he says you would think about the economy or about immigration or about any of the other issues that purport to be priorities in politics, because his personal depravity is so acute and so obvious that it won't matter. So that's mistake number one.
Yeah, it's the economy, stupid. Turns out it was the material conditions all along. Whilst there clearly was a significant sector of the electorate who were rightly concerned with Donald Trump's character and his undermining of democratic institutions, the voters that Harris needed to win were that of the precariat, whose most pressing concern is whether or not they can afford basic commodities. How could people like O'Brien have missed such a big voting cohort? Possibly because, as the wealthy darlings of the liberal media, they are themselves insulated from the cost of living crisis that the pandemic created across the world. Easy to miss material conditions when you yourself aren't even subject to them. Someone else who clearly wasn't paying attention was very best friend of the show, BFF in fact, Paul Mason, as he seems to have not been paying attention to anything Harris was saying on the campaign trail. He tweeted this: What good is a performative left? Our job is to fight fascism in the communities it's taking hold of. That means a principled, tough liberalism on crime, migration, and national pride. The American left's obsessions and actions just handed ammo to Trump in his battlegrounds. The Starmer Project is the only project in town. The left is either part of it or an obstacle to resisting what is coming. Was he just watching a different campaign? Has he just ignored the huge rightward shift on immigration policy where Harris was trying to outflank the Republicans to the right? The Democrats flatly rejected police reform and never repudiated tough on crime rhetoric. And on top of all of this, the Starmer Project he venerates quite literally sent their top strategists to advise Democrats, including Jonathan Ashworth, a man who couldn't hold one of the safest Labour seats in the country. Helena, what do you make of these outbursts by these upset liberals?
As you said in the segment that you just did there, right? They're not subject to the material conditions that everyone is subject to. I mean, you wonder why people don't have trust of the media in this country, right? There was a very famous clip that was going viral again recently of Emma Barnett just being absolutely perplexed at the idea somebody would reject the idea of billionaires existing when this is a majoritarian opinion held by lots of the UK population, right? But they're so completely detached from what normal people think about what normal people's concerns are. Again, because it's not a life that they lead. It's very difficult to be able to put yourselves in the mind or to empathize with the kind of electorate who did feel their concerns not being raised by the Democratic Party's campaign to the point at which Lewis Goodall couldn't even think of a single thing that they got wrong. It was a perfect campaign, right? It was just a red wave. It's a force of nature. It happened out of nowhere. Just the Republicans just happened to win this election, and there was nothing that Kamala Harris or the Democratic Party could have done differently. No strategic mistake at all. Oh, well, how about actually engaging with the people whose concerns were not being addressed by the Harris campaign? Because, of course, that would involve people that Lewis Goodall doesn't spend any time around, clearly. Otherwise, it's very much flying around the world with Emily Maitlis and John Sopel, maybe doing some vox pops to discover these people. But in terms of the people they hang around with, you're not going to meet these people at the Spectator Garden Party. You're not going to meet them at the halls of global media, are you? You're not. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And this is symptomatic of the way in which these kind of people also look towards Brexit. It's a very similar kind of rebellion against the establishment for people whose material conditions had deteriorated. And to bring it back, to circle it back around to Emily Maitlis and James O'Brien, like Emily Maitlis once quoted a passage from James O'Brien's 2023 book, How They Broke Britain, which is about all of the different forces that combine together to create the mess that we have right now. And James quotes a professor who did a 2019 study. They were saying, well, which showed that areas that were the most affected by austerity, the most affected and most impoverished by the slashing of the state and the public sector cuts of the Cameron and Oswald administration, were way more likely to have voted Leave than Remain during the Brexit referendum, and makes the case that if public spending hadn't been cut, we probably would have stayed in the European Union. And Emily Maitlis was just like shocked to find this out. Shocked. I can't believe that there's this link between austerity and Brexit voting. I'm just like, okay, you've now caught up with literally everyone else in the country who knows literally anybody north of the Watford Gap. Like the level at which you have to be completely divorced from reality to understand that, things like the collapse of the Red Wall and people who voted for Brexit, especially in these post-industrial communities who had every single part of their livelihood stripped away by Thatcherism and didn't see it get rebuilt by New Labour because they were pandering to a different sector of the electorate, to then have their communities even further impoverished by David Cameron and George Osborne. They had nowhere else to go. They had nobody speaking for them. And so they gravitated towards something that would break through the establishment, like Brexit. And that's what Trump represented to these same groups of people who had seen the deindustrialization destroy their communities as well. And he tapped into that because nobody else was speaking for them in the Clinton years, in the Bush years, and in the Obama years, where there was supposed to be this reconstruction post-financial crisis. It never happened in the US. It never happened here. And these same groups of voters are just never taken into account by the liberal media at large. And seeing these kind of surprised, these shocked Pikachu faces coming out of these people to learn, at least to James O'Brien's credit, he actually learns these things 5 years too late, unlike Lewis Goodall, who couldn't find a single criticism of the whole campaign when these things were going on. Just shows you, again, why our media is distrusted and why journalists, especially mainstream media journalists in this country, have not got pretty high approval ratings among the public because they don't speak for them anymore.
And that's why you need independent media like Novara Media. So please do support us if you don't already. If you'd like to give us some money, you can go to novaramedia.com/support. Thank you, Helena, so much for joining me tonight.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
And thanks everyone for watching. Come back tomorrow for another show from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.